All of these people identify themselves as Buddhists. What is it that they have in common? What Buddhists from Sri Lanka, from India, from Tibet, Nepal have in common is an ancient profession of faith known as the three refuges. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. This profession of faith has been central to Buddhism for over 2,500 years and indicates trust first in the Buddha, the enlightened one who gained nirvana and proclaimed the path to deliverance. Second, in the Dharma, the law or doctrine concerning that path. And third, the Sangha, the order or community of the faithful, those who have realized nirvana or are seeking to realize it. With me today is my University of Wisconsin colleague, Professor Stephen Beyer, a specialist in Buddhist studies. If we take these three refuges as the framework for our discussion, suppose we start at the beginning with the personality who is perhaps the most famous in India's long history. What can we actually say about the Buddha?
Well, actually, David, we can say very little. We have to remember that our earliest sources for the life of the Buddha were written down 300 years after his death. And it was several centuries after that that connected biographies began to be written as a genre of Buddhist literature. So what we really have as sources for the Buddha are sermons, wherein he would recall events of his life to illustrate a doctrinal point. These are clearly the concern of the earliest Buddhist community, and it's very hard to get back behind these particular vignettes. But the earliest Buddhist community did, in fact, select two events as being of primary importance, and these were the Enlightenment on the one hand and the Nirvana on the other. And I think the meaning of these two events was very different. The Enlightenment was an ecstatic and visionary penetration and insight into the nature of this world, whereas the Nirvana was a transcendence of the world, a final passing away, never to return, never to be reborn again. And the Enlightenment carried with it an existential commitment to preach the law he had discovered to sentient beings. Whereas after the Nirvana, Buddha had become, in some very profound sense, inaccessible to the community that he left behind. So we find in the life of the Buddha a bimodality. We find that he provides a mythological model of two very different modes of being in the world. But then, too, we can isolate some events that seem to have historic and factual significance. We do know that he was enlightened under a tree, and the place of the tree has been determined.
So these two modes of being then, in a sense, tell us something about the two schools, the Hinayana and the Mahayana schools.
In a way, yes, but on the other hand, the two schools were dealing with traditional material that dated back to the earliest community. They both dealt with the same body of material, selecting from it the stories and traditions that suited their own presuppositions. So, under the tree, for the Enlightenment, Buddha saw the nature of the world. It's described as a vision, as something that he saw. He saw the suffering of the world, he saw how beings passed away according to their deeds, and he saw the truth of nirvana. On this seat, strewn with sacred grass, the Buddha had this penetrating vision into the world. Here we see him seated with one hand in the meditation gesture, the other hand touching the earth to demonstrate his solidity and unshakableness under the tree. Proceeding then to preach the Dharma. Here in this Gupta image, his hands in the gesture called turning the wheel of the law, where Buddha went forth to preach the doctrine that he had learned. And the hands turning the wheel of the law represent the triumphal chariot wheel of the doctrine going to the four quarters of the world. So from town to town and village to village, the Buddha proceeded, preaching the truth that he had discovered under the tree, fulfilling his commitment to sentient beings before he finally passed away, lying down in the posture of a lion and passing away into the great final nirvana from which he would never return again.
Yes, well, from looking at the drama of this iconography, we might say then that the historical Buddha is as much a will-o'-the-wisp as the historical Jesus.
I think so, especially if we remember that between the death of the Buddha and the first written accounts, we have a period 10 times as long as the period between the death of Jesus and the first of the Synoptic Gospels.
So the Buddha is really a profound creation, an ideal religious expression of the community.
I think Buddha functioned in the earliest community as a mythological model, providing alternative ways of being in the world and alternative goals for the religious quest, yes.
Turning now to the second of the three refuges, the Dharma, could one say that there are specific doctrinal points of agreement?
I think if we had to isolate something like the essence of Buddhism, a good place to look would be the Four Noble Truths, which Buddha preached during his first sermon after his enlightenment. These are the noble truths of suffering and of cessation and of the origin of suffering and of the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. The first of these is suffering. Here in a Tibetan painting, we see the Lord of Death holding the wheel of life, depicting universal suffering in the jaws of death. Now, very closely connected with the idea of death and suffering is the notion of karma. Because if suffering is all there is, then suicide would be the answer. But suicide only precipitates one into further life. Here we see Yama himself presiding over the judgment of the dead, as the deeds of the person are weighed and the person is condemned to his destiny. So that there is only one way out of this. The only way out of this suffering here depicted in hell, or the suffering of being a hungry ghost condemned to hunger and thirst, having a belly as big as a barrel and a mouth as small as a needle, is through nirvana. Or a destiny might be that of being a demigod in perpetual bloody and futile warfare with the gods. Or rebirth among the gods themselves, whose desire and whose beauty and whose pleasure is destined to fade away as they themselves use up the karma of which this is their reward. And among men, the destiny of men is birth and old age and disease and death. Or among animals, where people drive the animals with kicks and blows, or the animals devour each other. There is always a threefold relationship between suffering and karma and nirvana. So that following the pattern of the medical diagnosis, the next step is to determine the cause of suffering. And here it's depicted on this painting as being lust, hatred, and delusion. The serpent representing hatred, the rooster representing lust, and the pig representing delusion, being the center of the wheel around which people rise to their higher destinies or sink to their lower destinies. So the way out, once these are eliminated, is nirvana, here represented architecturally by the balanced masses of a stupa, where we see the railing around the stupa enclosing the sacred space, which represents the total transcendence of nirvana architecturally and artistically by the hemispherical dome resting on the static horizontal planes of the balustrade that surrounds it. And around it is a gate separating this realm of transcendence from the realm of immanence outside, isolating the relic of the Buddha within from the profane world. The balustrades and staircases never lead directly to the center, but always in a spiral pattern around it. And the gateways outside are teeming with the life that is cut off from the still center within. On the gateways are sculpted the goddesses who are the fertility of the trees and the fruitfulness of the earth, separated from the stillness that is the transcendence of the Buddha within the stupa. Even from his enlightenment, Buddha was in effect in a stupa. He was transcendent. He was beyond the world. Here we see worshippers at a stupa representing his nirvana. But even under the tree itself, Buddha was absent in a very profound sense. This is called the aniconic tradition of Buddhist sculpture because it represents Buddha's transcendence by his absence, even under the tree where he receives the worship of the gods. Here's the famous miracle of Buddha walking on the water. We see the birds and the trees and the boat. We see the waves carefully sculpted. But Buddha himself, walking on the water, is absent because in the miracle itself, he is, in a profound sense, no longer there. He has passed beyond the world. The fourth noble truth, then, is that there is a path to this cessation. And here again we find the different modalities being expressed in different sermons given by the Buddha. We even find idiosyncratic meditations that are given to individual meditators. And one of the tasks that devolved upon the earliest stratum of commentators was to try and make some sense out of this mass of often inchoate material in the primary documents. So here we find a number of formulations where a structure is given, a formal route which one can travel to the end of the path, to cessation, to nirvana. We find, for example, the three learnings of virtue, of meditation, and of wisdom. We find meditations of calm and of insight. The first, in a sense, imitating the nirvana by calming the mind, withdrawing the senses from outward objects, and focusing down upon a particular meditative theme. The second, in a sense, imitating the Buddha's enlightenment as providing a way of penetrating with insight into the nature of the phenomenal world. But the end of these meditations tends, in the commentarial literature, to be listed under three rubrics. The realization that all events are, first of all, anitya, impermanent, bound to pass away. Secondly, that they are anatman, that they have no self, that there is no permanent substance that abides beneath phenomenal appearances, and thus that all events are dukkha, are suffering. Within the realm of becoming, there is nothing satisfactory at all, ever. And to realize this is then to attain cessation, to cut the bonds of karma that bind us to the world, and to achieve the cessation of suffering.
Now there's a third refuge, the sagha, and when we consider this, one feels really that we're entering into one of the most vigorous and extensive monastic disciplines in the history of religion.
This is true, and unfortunately only a fragment of the old monastic traditions have really come down to us. We are most familiar in the West with the monastic tradition called Theravada, who maintained their scriptures in a language called Pali, the sacred language. They spread to Ceylon very early in the history of Buddhism, and from there to most of Southeast Asia. And so they survived when Buddhism disappeared from mainland India. But we find that there were any number of sects writing their canons in both regional languages and in Sanskrit. One of the things they had in common was that they tended to have three different classes of literature. That they had vinaya, or monastic rules, with broad overall agreement about the major categories of offenses against monastic propriety. They all had sutra, that is, remembrances of the sermons delivered by the Buddha on various moral or doctrinal points. And some of them added a third basket of literature called abhidharma, that is, scholastic elaborations upon the doctrinal themes set forth in the sutra literature.
And then there's the whole matter of the schismatic tendencies of early Buddhism.
As a matter of fact, there were a number of councils that were held in order to determine truth or falsehood on doctrinal points. And at these councils, we find various sects either declaring themselves orthodox or being declared heterodox by other sects. One of the first major schisms was when the Mahasanghikas, the great assembly, that is, the group that was in the majority, broke off from the Sthaviravada, the elders who claimed that they were maintaining the oldest Buddhist tradition, on issues that seemed to center on questions of the status of the enlightened person more than anything else, although there may well have been disputes concerning the nature of ecclesiastical law as well. The records aren't quite clear. Another schism took place when the Sarvastivadins, again, split off from the Sthaviras on questions of the ontological status of the past and the future. That is a question that's intimately related to the notion of karma, and one of the central concerns of Buddhism. Then again, from the Sarvastivadins, we find another group breaking off, the Sautrantikas, disputing with them on the nature of the authority to be granted to the Abhidharma literature, as opposed to the sutras themselves. But the one thing, I think, that binds the community together more than anything else is the fact that every 2 weeks, all Buddhist monastic organizations recite the Pratimoksha, the list of the monastic rules that every monk must follow, must declare his culpability if he has broken, and must declare, finally, his purity. This is what has bound the community together for 2,500 years of its existence.
So like the profession of the three refuges, this becomes a thread that is in common.
Very much so, yes.
Now, essentially, we've been dealing with the Hinayana tradition of the individual who follows the career of the Buddha in achieving his personal salvation. But you mentioned earlier the dual model of the Buddha's career, and the fact that not only did he achieve nirvana, but he also was a teacher of the way. And this has led to a common association in the minds of scholars between the ideal of the arhat, the one individual who becomes worthy of salvation, and the bodhisattva, the being of enlightenment, who remains in this existence, continues to be reborn as a teacher, one who assists others on the path. And that this would be a way of understanding the Hinayana tradition over against the development of the Mahayana schools. Now, I sense that it's really a bit more complex than such a one-to-one relationship.
It really is, because when we look at the earliest Mahayana texts, we find that this new way, the path to Buddhahood, is actually being declared by the great old arhats. What we're dealing with is actually a very complex religious and social phenomenon that broke loose in northern India around the turn of the millennium, and that involved, I think, 4 different factors. It was, first of all, a religious revitalization movement. It was governed by a sense of enthusiasm in its literal sense, a sense of excitement at this new vision of Buddhahood, open to everybody. And it was, secondly, a reordering of moral priorities to make room for moral action in this world, a concern that tended to be slighted when the major emphasis was on transcendence of the world and the denigration of the world as being nothing but suffering and unsatisfactoriness. So in the center of the moral stage, instead of personal virtue, came the virtue of compassion for all creatures who are suffering in the world. Thirdly, it was a revival of archaic and ecstatic visionary contemplative techniques. Here again, participating in a movement that seemed to have swept over all of northern India and to have produced its effects in the great Indian epic, the Mahabharata, and in the Bhagavad Gita as well. And fourthly, it was a reworking of metaphysics. First of all, to account for the new kinds of contemplative experience that were being generated by the movement, and also to provide a metaphysical foundation for the value of moral action in the world. So that we find that there is a new literature being produced, an enthusiastic, visionary literature preaching these new doctrines. And in a sense, this makes it even simpler than it appeared before, because a Mahayanist can then be defined as one who attributes this new literature to the Buddha himself and considers it authentic, whereas a Hinayanist is one who denies the canonical authenticity of this new literature that was being produced at the time. So that just as before we saw the transcendence of nirvana being symbolized by the closed stupa, we find in the new literature the ideal of the open stupa. In texts like the Prajnaparamita or the Siddharma Pundarika, we find vision quests of people seeking the Buddhas, who instead of having passed away are still preaching. In the Siddhartha Pundarika, we find that the lotus of the true law is preached by the Buddha and also by another Buddha from within a stupa, so that we can see that architecturally a new form is being produced to match the new metaphysics, so that we find in the developing art of this time a new type of artistic representation. Instead of the balanced geometrical masses of transcendence that we find in the closed stupa, the stupa opens to reveal within it the Buddha or the Bodhisattva, who has descended down into it and has realized the emptiness, the shunyata, the lack of substantiality that underlies everything, and returns bearing this to the world. In other words, a reenactment of Buddha's enlightenment by passing through and beyond the trajectory of the nirvana. So that we find within the stupa, coming outward to aid all beings, both the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas, those who are following his path. And we find a good deal of the literature devoted to the notion of stages, of bhumi, where we find the growing magical power of the Bodhisattva, his increasing visionary abilities to create alternative universes filled with jeweled trees, and which his followers can listen to him preach the law. And we find, too, as time goes by, even more profound socioeconomic changes in the nature of the Sangha. We find that there are established during the Gupta dynasty vast monastic universities. And with the waning of the original enthusiasm for Mahayana, this moral vision of Buddhahood for all, we find that a new kind of consciousness develops in the monastic universities. We find that a new personality type is being developed, that what were once profound ethical and metaphysical disagreements are subordinated to the notion of an encyclopedic curriculum, that the curriculum in the monastic university embraces all doctrine. And we find that the ideal becomes no longer the arhat or the bodhisattva, but the scholar, the man of encyclopedic learning, of great subtlety in argument, and above all, a man who knows how the doctrines can be arranged hierarchically in order to establish priority of one to the other. But none are neglected. All are included in this vast, all-embracing Buddhist metaphysical and doctrinal system that developed in the universities.
These would be at Nalanda and Takshashila.
These are universities like Nalanda and Takshashila, where pilgrims from China, from Central Asia, gathered to imbibe Buddhism at its source in India. We see here some of the cells that have been excavated at Nalanda. Here the monks would live and attend the rituals and attend classes. The standard Buddhist architecture is observed of a central courtyard surrounded by cells containing beds. And here is one of the monks' beds, and next to it a niche that has been carved for his books, where he can keep his books.
This scholarly ideal, this cloistered seclusion of the monk, was challenged one more time by the traditions that emerged from the interactivity of the tantric traditions, the whole search for an esoteric means of salvation, for the gaining of magical powers, the old traditions of Hatha Yoga, all of which produced the Vajrayana school, the third vehicle of Buddhism. And here, of course, an interactivity with Hinduism in the Tantra. And we should really consider what are the essential features of Buddhist Tantrism.
Well, I think that part of the essence of the Buddhist Tantras is that they are a magical means of storming the gates of Buddhahood, of, in effect, kicking open the gates of bliss that lie within the body itself, of casting off the stale bonds of accumulated custom that hide us from our own true spontaneous nature, our innate Buddhahood, and the use of magical techniques in order to achieve this. A threefold homologization of the semen, the breath, and the mind, so that to control the centers of the body is to control the mind itself and the very sources of Buddhahood. So the new type of Buddhist saint was long-haired, mad, endowed with magic power, like this Tibetan painting of Saraha, the arrow maker. Often these men had low-caste occupations, and they consorted with low-caste women. They sang in the vernacular, in the street language. They sang in puns and riddles, and they used images, such as the image of the whore that we find in this poem by Kanha, the Black One. And he says, existence and nirvana are the two drums, mind and breath are the two cymbals. The bass drum resounds, ja, ja, victory, victory, as Kanha goes off to marry the whore. The whore is married, birth is eaten up, the dowry is the highest law. Day and night pass in lovemaking, the night is brightened with my lady's flame. The yogin who is devoted to the whore does not leave her for a moment. He is drunk with the spontaneous. And here the image of the whore represents wisdom, as we find also in Gnostic literature. For wisdom opens herself to all who seek her, but does not open herself to those with caste or status or intellectual pride, but only to the yogi who will dance with her.
Right. Now, we know a great deal about the decline of institutional Buddhism in the medieval period and the factors of a combination of forces of the emergence of Islam as a power in North India and the reestablishment of Hinduism, particularly reinforced from southern bhakti devotional traditions and other factors. But one curious feature of the contemporary period is that in India there is a revivalist tradition. And the so-called Neo-Buddhists are largely the creation of one man, B.R. Ambedkar, who declared himself a Buddhist by taking Diksha in 1956 on the 100th anniversary of the Mahaparinirvana of the Buddha, and called for followers. And largely from the Mahar tradition, the untouchable community of Maharashtra, he gained some 380,000 converts. Today, these number almost 4 million. And we see here a funeral procession of Buddhists, Neo-Buddhists in Maharashtra, following the tradition of burial rather than Hindu cremation, the tradition that they practiced, of course, well before. And here the funeral is completed after burial and mourning traditions by the chanting of a number of Buddhist sutras.
Another example of revival-type activity in the present day is the revival of the old contemplative technique of satipatthana, of mindfulness of the breath and body, by a dedicated group of Burmese monks who have sent out missionaries throughout the Buddhist world and have made this now, probably next to Zen, one of the most widespread contemplative techniques in Buddhism. Buddhism has never really lacked the strength to go back to its own roots to revitalize itself.
Now, from this outline sketch of Buddhism, we have time really to deal only with India. And we should take really the time to deal more thoroughly with Himalayan Buddhism, with the Buddhist traditions of Tibet and Nepal. And that will be the subject of our next program.